Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Jackie Cawley from the Delean Institute for Growth and Wellness, and we are so excited to have you here today discussing an important topic for personal and professional development, handling difficult conversations. So they're called difficult conversations for a reason, right? They're usually high-stake discussions that you need to have with somebody that are going to be emotionally charged. And because of that, it's really important to be clear on your goals and to prepare and plan. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the 4 pieces I like to use with regards to planning and holding these difficult conversations. But let's first start with just difficult conversations. What kind of conversations are we talking about? Well, these are usually the conversations that you need to have with your boss when asking for a promotion or a raise. It may be the conversation that you need to have with someone like your partner or a family member or a friend because there's issues in your relationships. It may be related to a coworker or an employee whose behavior is impacting things negatively. Or it could even be, for example, a conversation with your adult child who needs to move on, get a job, and move out of your home. Whatever the conversation is, remember, because it's emotionally charged, oftentimes it will make us feel uncomfortable, so we may want to put it off. And it can create anxiety. So being able to prepare, have a plan, and really learn some steps in managing those conversations can be helpful in getting your goals met and having that conversation be successful for both parties. So before we get started, I think it's important for us just to talk about effective communication in general. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen with you. So difficult conversations, how to successfully manage through them. And as we pull up the next slide here, you can see that I've got a quote here that I really like. Speak when you are angry and you will make the best speech you will ever regret, by Ambrose Bierce. Now, I love this because it's always a reminder to me that you don't want your emotions to lead in a conversation. You want to understand your emotions, name them, validate them, but not lead the conversation. You want to allow your leadership skills to lead the conversation instead. As we mentioned, the power of communication is especially important to pay attention to when the stakes are high and the emotions are too. So when we think about effective communications, there's some fundamentals, and these are often referred to as the 4 C's. Connection, thinking about your relationship, being respectful, compassionate and caring, as I mentioned above. And then the second being collaboration. Regardless of when you're having this conversation, you always need to think about the other person and how do you come together in order to find shared understanding of the issue and then do problem solving in a way that gets your goals met and is a win-win for both parties. A third fundamental is concentration. And when I think about concentration, for me, it's about having focus, thinking about a private space. What are my goals? How am I coming to this meeting? Am I really concentrating on the conversation in the other party as well as myself in order to get our needs met? And then the fourth is candidness, being honest and having truly authentic conversations. So these basic fundamentals are important, and you'll see them weave through as we talk a little bit more in part 1 of this series of holding those important conversations. There are a number of key points to consider when you're having these conversations. One is that the conversation is not a contest. People sometimes walk into these conversations allowing their emotions to really lead the conversation, not their minds. And because of that, they end up going in as if there's going to be a winner and a loser, but there is no winner in these situations. You always want to try to find a win-win solution in these conversations. The second is that in order to know if the conversation is successful, you have to be really clear about what your goal is. What are you trying to achieve, and how would you know if you achieved that outcome? So thinking about what's a metric or what's a way for me to measure what success looks like in order for me to be sure that I've achieved that clear goal that I set out for myself. Next, you want to understand that conversations are two-sided. So you want to be open and honest, compassionate, and respectful. As I've mentioned, you'll hear me say those things a number of times because, again, these are difficult, very charged discussions. So we want to make sure that we're being honest as well as being open, compassionate, and respectful. Both parties need to be engaged and participate. This isn't a lecture. You're not a symposium giving your thoughts on a subject. You're having a conversation, and that means there's two people. So you have to make sure that both of you are engaged in talking to one another and sharing information with one another, communicating as effectively as you can together, and that both are participating. If you are running into a situation where the other person just shuts down, you need to be aware of that because maybe it's not the right time for you to be having this conversation, and you need to be able to just elicit what's going on with that individual by asking questions. The other thing that's important to think about as you're having these conversations is active listening. And when we talk about active listening, what often happens when you speak, the other person is already thinking of what they want to respond to your comments about. And the same thing happens for us, right? For you, that someone will be saying something, and instead of really listening to them, you're already in your head thinking about what's my response? How am I responding to this? What do I need to say back to this individual? So it's really important to make sure that you're listening actively so that you can understand what the other person is saying. You be able to know when to ask appropriate questions to get a little bit more information from them using appreciative inquiry, and making sure that that person feels as if you have truly listened to them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about body language. The other thing to really keep in mind is that all of us come to these conversations with our own set of perspectives and our own filters based on the way that we have learned and experienced ourselves in the world over our entire lifetime. So as we have different experiences, we take that information, we put it inside of our memory banks in our subconscious mind. And those experiences and the way we were brought up, perhaps the way that we were taught in the past, either by coaches or teachers or our parents or others, all of those things come together to create how we come to the table with our perspective, our biases, and our internal filters, almost like, glasses, if you will, that we put on when we come to a conversation. The other person comes with these as well. And I think we often remember ours, right? We're thinking about that ourselves, but we don't always take into consideration the other person and how they may have filters that differ from ours. They may have perspectives that are very different from ours as well. The way that I like to think about it is that when you talk about that story about all the different people who come blind to touch an elephant, and each of the people that are touching the elephant are saying, I feel a tail, no, I feel the nose, no, I feel the side of the skin and it's this way, or I feel a tusk. Everyone is touching and feeling something different, so they're bringing something to what is the whole, but it's each person's perspective, right? So you have to be able to think about and honor both your perspective and what the other person's perspective and filters are and the way that they see the world. So you want to think about putting yourself in their shoes. And the last thing that you want to think about when you're just even preparing and planning for these conversations is that space and place are both important as the conversation itself. If you pick a space that is a poor environment, is not safe, or doesn't feel private for the conversation, you're not going to be able to get your needs met. So do make sure to consider space and place. In our next section, we'll talk about how to successfully manage through difficult conversations by thinking about them in 4 parts. Now, for me, phase 1 is really around preparation and planning, and I call it the 3 Ps, and we'll go into that in the next section. The second phase is actually scheduling and committing to having that conversation with the other person. And the sooner you do that, the better, right? Because you don't want to put these difficult conversations off any longer than you need to. It just creates more anxiety and can create more conflict and misunderstanding if you don't do so. The third phase has to do with actually holding the conversation, and there's tips and tricks in that, and we'll get to that in part 3. And then our fourth phase is actually really taking time to reflect and to follow up and have next steps prepared after you hold the conversation. So we'll go through all of those phases in the next 2 parts of our series. Just again, want to reiterate that difficult conversations are difficult for a reason. They're emotionally charged. They're very anxiety provoking. But that said, you can still effectively communicate and manage those conversations and get your goals met. Can't wait to see you next time for our part 2 in the series. Thanks.